we're going to continue with this conversation. This morning, as we heard, we started with trust in the NGO sector is going up. We can be a great example. The last session, we really teed up for this session because we talked about in the last one how you have to pivot. And in order to be successful in that pivoting, you actually have to engage with your stakeholders. And we're delighted to have Will Friedman, who is the president of Public Agenda. It's a nonprofit which helps advance progress on key issues such as community engagement, education, and healthcare. In 2007, Will established what is now called the Yankelovich Center for Public Engagement at Public Agenda, which conducts research to evaluate impacts and improve practice. Will is also the author of numerous publications and co-editor of the book Toward Wiser Public Judgment. So let's welcome Will Friedman. And joining him in our discussion today is Aria Finger, CEO of DoSomething.org, and Kyung B. Yoon, Executive Director, Korean American Community Foundation. And of course, as we always do, we have these bios in your kits. So with that, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. That was a great panel. It's fun to follow it up. I think there's going to be interesting overlap, as Claire was suggesting, because a lot of the things they were talking about in terms of pivoting, in terms of trying to do your work better, engaging stakeholders, smart and effective ways is key to doing that. So I think it's going to be fun to get into that and see where those overlaps are. My organization, Public Agenda, nonprofit like yours, dedicated to expanding opportunity, strengthening democracy through nonpartisan research and public engagement. So this theme of engagement is one that's sort of at the heart and soul of our work, but it's really one that everybody needs to be paying attention to. And the argument is a pretty simple one, really, that creatively engaging people crucial to your mission can profoundly strengthen your work, make you smarter, more effective, build the partnerships that you need. And you kind of heard that in the last conversation at different points. It sounds kind of commonsensical and simple, but I contend that it's actually harder than it sounds to think that through, be strategic, and do it well. Most leaders and organizations are really geared towards a kind of a top-down, one-way kind of communication in a lot of respects about, branding in ways that present you well and make people kind of resonate well with you, and that's important to do, and getting your message out in effective ways, and getting people, your target audiences, to do the things you want them to do to support you and so forth. All that's important. But here we're trying to dig towards a level beyond that that's important to add. So rather than trying to influence audiences to do the things that you want them to do, we're talking about really engaging, really listening, creating some kind of a two-way street of interactivity, more akin to dialogue than messaging, that can change not just the target audience, quote unquote, but you and your organization and the way you think about your work and the relationships that you have. And so I mean dialogue in some sense of the term. In this day and age, it can be digital and online as well as face-to-face. My own philosophy is that both are important, have different strengths and weaknesses. But certainly, and you're going to hear in this panel where we have very different organizations, sort of different emphases around that. But it involves thinking about who are your stakeholders, who's crucial to your success. Certainly, the people you're trying to serve is a category to think of. Obviously, funders. We all think about funders all the time. Potential partners, volunteers, champions are people to think about. Also, potential obstructors. who, if we engage them, can raise our game, help us be much, much smarter, especially selected ones that are our sort of smartest critics, can be really useful to engage. So when done well, the concept is when done well, engagement creates relationships and insights that can really drive our work and drive our work through hard time. That's all fairly abstract. We want to work to make that concrete and practical as we discuss it this morning, and to do that we have a couple of wonderful nonprofit leaders. Kyung-Bi Yoon, Executive Director of the Korean American Community Foundation, Arya Finger, CEO of DoSomething.org. And I'd like to just start by asking you guys just to introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about the organization, a few words about yourself, the organization you lead, your mission, your work, and some of the challenges you face. And then we'll kind of dig into the topic.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning. I'm so pleased to be here. 15 years ago, I was a part of a small dinner with fellow Korean Americans that came together around a dinner time conversation about how those of us who are immigrants, children of immigrants. I came to America when I was 6 years old and have grown up here. Don't speak Korean very well. I was so privileged to be able to have opportunities of an education, to be able to speak English well. But then we also recognize that you also lose something in the process, which is that just in the way that, I lost my Korean. That in many ways, the message that many of us as immigrants grew up with is that success is to get out of Flushing or to get away from your community. And there we were, and I will say it was a kind of a curated group because it was, we'd been invited by the then Consul General to New York from Korea as some of the successful Korean Americans. And there were the managing directors from investment banks and the, tenured professors in universities. And I was there actually because I was the first Korean American broadcast reporter in New York City. I used to be on Fox 5. And so Juju Chang and I were sort of there representing the media people. So we got together and, there is this pervasive stereotype of the Asian Americans being the model minority, and we definitely represented that. But we also recognized there was many elements of luck and hard work as well, but that this wasn't the full picture of the Korean American story in New York, that actually 1 in 5 Korean Americans live in poverty, that Korean Americans have the highest uninsured rates of any ethnic group in America. The rates of mental health issues, eating disorders, depression, suicide are the highest among young girls, 16 to 24 in the Asian American community. That's not just Korean. We didn't know that ourselves, and certainly we realized that there were so many needs that were marginalized and very invisible to funders and to sources of support. So we organized the Korean American Community Foundation, not to provide direct service, but really to leverage our connections and our resources to get more funding to nonprofits that are serving our vulnerable neighbors. That was 15 years ago. In our first year, just by shaking down our friends and family, we raised $60,000 that we gave out to 5 community organizations. We were very proud of that. This year, our 15th anniversary, we'll be surpassing $6 million in grants, and we are now one of the largest institutional funders of the Asian American community. So we've learned a lot of lessons along the way. It's really been around engaging our community, certainly of fellow donors that we've brought along, but also our community partners, our grantees. And I'll be happy to get into that, but that is just in a nutshell what the Korean American Community Foundation is and my role. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. So I see women who are about my age in the audience, so I think you guys might be the right audience to remember the early 90s show Melrose Place, where Andrew Shue was the heartthrob star. So when Andrew Shue was at the height of his fame in 1993, he was about to be one of People's 50 Most Beautiful People. He was sort of a lifelong athlete and also a lifelong community service advocate. And so he said, community service should be as cool as sports and as integral to our daily life as anything else. And so he launched Do Something because he wanted young people all around the US and all around the globe to do something to better their communities. And so Do Something was enormously successful in the early 90s, all sorts of celebrities. We were in every blockbuster in the country, which is where you wanted to be in the 90s. And Christina Aguilera, we were the official charity of that tour. Do Something then fell on some hard times in the late 90s. And in 2003, Nancy Lublin, the founder of Dress for Success, came on board as sort of the new executive director in 2003 and said, this organization has so much potential, the brand is so good, yet it was the year after Friendster, the year before Facebook. We need to put this online. We need to use digital tools to empower young people to take action in their communities. At the time, I was an economics major at Washington University. All of my friends were going off to consulting firms, and I was pretty stubborn. And I was like, I'm going to show you that not-for-profits can be efficient and effective, and we can sort of use the best practices of business to do good in the nonprofit world. And I joined in 2005 a tiny little 6-person organization called Do Something that had big dreams. And so that was 11 years ago. So job hopping millennials is not true because I have been in my job for 11 years. I'm the exception that proves the rule. I took over a year ago as the CEO, and now we are 5.5 million young people, predominantly here in the US, and our goal is twofold. One is we think young people can affect every issue. They can stop global warming and fight discrimination and fight bullying and advocate against the school-to-prison pipeline and all of these issues. But then actually our first goal is to transform this generation. All of the problems in the world are man-made, not women, man-made, global warming, discrimination, all these things. And if we create this new generation, when they're leading the charge as politicians, nonprofit leaders, business leaders, perhaps they'll make better decisions than we did. And so that's what we do. Again, we use the power of digital, text messaging, social media, Facebook Messenger, whatever it might be, to get young people to take action online, but more importantly, offline in their local communities. We really see sort of a global, local aspect as being really important to what we do.
Great. Okay, so 3 kind of very different organizations up here, one topic. Let's get down to cases a little bit more and think and talk about how creative and robust engagement with important stakeholders can enhance our work. And I'm going to lead us off with a story from my organization, and we'll move it around. So at Public Agenda, our work is about strengthening civic engagement and democratic problem solving on tough public issues, especially those that impinge on people's opportunities to better themselves in life, such as education, healthcare, jobs, things like that. And we now find ourselves, our work taking place in a democracy that it's not just a problematic policy environment, but it's an environment where democracy itself is in crisis. And a lot of our institutions and sort of norms and ways of doing things, democratically speaking, are shifting and in some respects under threat. So it's leading us. I mean, this is the pivot panel as well. I mean, it's really leading us to do some thinking about how we're focusing in our work at this point in time. And to do that, we've been engaging a whole bunch of stakeholders in a bunch of different directions. I mean, on the one hand, we're doing, as I think probably a bunch of the organizations represented here, kind of a strategic refresh kind of process of some kind to think about how the shifting environment is affecting us and what the dangers and opportunities are. And so we're doing a lot of conversations with current and potential funders, board members, friendly critics of the organization, and staff as well, and just kind of rethinking how we're prioritizing and doing what we do. But we're also have been doing a lot of outreach to our ultimate client, which for Public Agenda is really the general public. So for the past year, we've been doing focus groups around the country talking to folks about the themes of opportunity and inequality, which we're viewing as sort of underlying dynamics, or our hypothesis, those are underlying dynamics to a lot of the upheaval that's going on. And we just came out with a report called The Fix We're In which we identified a kind of a different picture from the two Americas metaphor and image that is sort of dominating the discourse. Because we found, even though there's some truth to that, certainly, that we're divided in a lot of ways, we found a surprising amount of common ground around some fundamentals. And chief among that is a sense among the public, whether it's in different parts of the country, Republicans and Democrats, different ages and races and so forth, with variations, but this sense that people's opportunities are diminishing based on a political system that's totally impenetrable to them. So, you know, that a political system that's unresponsive to the likes of them. And the them, again, is very broad. Different regions, different demographics, you know, that our politics, our democracy is responding to wealthy special interests, but not to the needs of regular people. And there's no way to participate. There's sort of no way in. And it's sort of a no-exit situation, which is creating a lot of desperation and anger and frustration. So, I mean, there's this common experience out there, and also a good amount of common ground on some potential solutions around educational equity, the idea of infrastructure to create jobs, minimum wage experiments, controlling the influence of money on politics, creating a more empowering form of democratic participations for communities and, quote, regular citizens. So that's sort of, you know, what we found by listening to essentially who we're supposed to be serving, and it's really affecting the way we're thinking about our work going forward. We're framing it differently, we're focusing it differently, as you heard in the pivot conversation, we're letting go of some things and doubling down on others as a result. So that's sort of our latest lived experience in terms of dealing with change in the environment, and figuring out what it means for us, but not doing it sort of in our own little bubble, but doing it in conversation with the critical people that we're either serving or can help us be successful. So with that as one version of this, I'd like to ask the panelists for an example or two of how you think about this kind of thing, how you think about engagement, who are your critical stakeholders who can have an impact on your success, and specific ways you get feedback or engage with them or have conversations that inform your work or strengthen your work.
Okay. So as Will said, I mean, we all know we're operating in a very different environment, and certainly for immigrants, like the community that I'm working in and that I represent, things have shifted. When I said earlier that, you know, most Koreans that you will meet in New York City are immigrants or children of immigrants, that's not a broad generalization. It's really true because the bulk of immigration from my country did not happen until the Immigration Act in 1965. So you're really seeing that, you know, immigrants started coming in. I mean, that's when all the, you know, Korean grocery stores started popping up, right, in the 70s and the 80s, and, you know, and now they're all like disappearing because the children don't want to go in, but that's a whole other conversation. So, you know, we're talking about, and so why are we immigrants and children of immigrants? It's actually, and this I will go a little bit on a soapbox, it's because the U.S. excluded certain ethnicities. And you may or may not know this about the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s, the fact that Japanese Americans who actually were green card holders, you know, were denied citizenship until, you know, until the 1960s. Of course, I hope you know about the internment, the registration of Japanese citizens, and during World War II. So Asian American community, we know a lot about firsthand about what it feels like to be denied rights and to be registered, to be seen as the enemy because of our ethnicity. And I think that is why we're seeing a lot of activism in the Asian American community around what's happening right now with Islamophobia and all the climate. So I will say, though, that when I see Korean Americans like me, and we call ourselves sort of the 1.5 generation, kind of came here at a young age, but are not second generation. We didn't grow up with a mindset of philanthropy. We just grew up trying to survive in this country, and we saw our parents just thinking about the immediate needs and not really anything, just like a roof over the head and food on the table, and anything left over they put into their children's education. So we found that for our community foundation in engaging Korean Americans around the idea of giving, we had to start at a very different place, possibly from others that, I see my friends in the Jewish community who grow up with with training around mitzvah, around giving back, and we certainly didn't grow up with that. So one of the things that we do for our foundation very intentionally is we practice participatory grant making. We have every year with our grant cycle, we engage volunteers. This can be our donors or just young people. People who commit to come and get training around community issues, and then also around just how to read a grant proposal 101, what are the kinds of questions to ask, and then in small teams they get to go on site visits and conduct interviews and make recommendations. Ultimately, they don't have decision-making power over our grants, but they get very, very invested. And what's been really fascinating to us is that the culmination of what we call this community grant making committee is a half day where people come and each team makes a case for why we should or should not grant to the organization that they were in charge of. And in the beginning, we used to see everybody saying, "You must fund this organization." I mean, the handicapped young people or the senior citizens, and people would be so passionate. But as we did this year after year, and we had some of our community grants committee members who returned, they actually started to get very passionate why we should not fund certain organizations too. And we really saw that as a growth in our, that they were getting beyond sort of the heart tugging and to really looking at what are effective organizations. What are the kind of sustainability issues? So a good example is, in the beginning, we will have committee members will say, "This is a great organization, it's all volunteer run." Like, how passionate they must be. And then over time, you'll see them saying, "Well, that's not a very strong organization. They've had a lot of turnover," and so we see that growth as in donors and as volunteers, and that's really, really important because for us, our mission is not only to get more resources to underserved neighbors in the community, but really to raise up new generations of more thoughtful, strategic, educated philanthropists. And whether or not they will give to our foundation, if they decide to serve on a board of a nonprofit that they got to know, or if they are, maybe they'll have their own foundation one day and they'll be able to make a bigger impact, we see that as a win. So that's been a really important way for us to be engaging our stakeholder community in one area.
Great. I'm wondering if there's any conversations going on that you've been part of in philanthropy more broadly about participatory funding.
Yeah, so I think that let's face it, like, it's a pain. I mean, like, in many ways, I mean, this is a program that we take on because when I say it's a pain, it's anytime we could be making our grant decisions much more efficiently, right? We have program staff, we have, skilled experts, and so it draws out sort of our sort of grant cycle, and honestly, for our grantee applicants too, we have to kind of prime them. I mean, many of you, like, you can imagine, like, when you apply for a grant, if you're told that you're going to have like 2 or 3 volunteers who are going to come and conduct the interview, and like, it's a bit of a burden actually also to place on on the nonprofits themselves. But if we all see it as part of something bigger than the actual grant decision, I think that it becomes something that is more understandable. But I don't think it's necessarily it's necessarily a tool for all funders, but certainly for the public foundations, the ones that do have to raise funds to give out, that don't have the big endowments. It is a very, very important way of that kind of passion that we see among our committee members who have made that effort to go out there, to get to know an organization, to get to know the issues, and we have to be clear, they are shepherded. I mean, they are supervised by our staff. They don't go and do these interviews alone. They are, it's really a sort of learning cycle for them. So I think it is something. I know the New York Women's Foundation. I think there are a number of public foundations that follow this model of participatory grant making.
Okay, and before we move on, just the index routine applies, so the index card, so if you have questions, work them that way. Arya, how's this topic apply to your work or not?
No, absolutely. Piggyback a little bit on what you said about really understanding your stakeholders. And so, not to relitigate this election, but clearly one of the reasons people in this room might have felt like they lost the election is because we didn't understand the electorate. We didn't understand our stakeholders. And so we have the words "fight for the user." It's a mural in our office. We always want to understand who our stakeholders are, and you so often find that is difficult because the people who run homeless shelters, majority weren't formerly homeless. The people who run schools aren't children. And even if you do look like the people that you serve, you aren't the people that you serve. No matter what, everyone is diverse and has different opinions. And so I think that part of the problem is just the assumption that you do know and that you are in touch with your stakeholders in some way. And so when we're dealing with young people, first of all, my title is Chief Old Person, and that's not even tongue-in-cheek. I'm one of the oldest people in the office, and I can't pretend to understand what a 17, 18, 19-year-old is going through right now. They're aliens to me. And so if you go by sort of the media myths, okay, young people are on Snapchat all day, they're selfish, they don't care about the real world, all millennials live in cities, there's sort of all of these myths that are going around. And so what we try to do is sort of debunk those myths as best we can. And I think the social media myth is really interesting because so often we have other nonprofits coming to us, say the American Cancer Society or a big sort of institutional nonprofit that's focused on a cause, and they say, oh, if you could just get your young people to tweet for us, it would be incredible. And you have to realize that that's what you want, that's not what they want. And so, again, it's sort of obvious, but really taking the time to think about what are the pain points and what are the things that sort of your members and your users need to know. One really stupid specific example was we wanted all of our young people, all of our members to do something at the same time. And we thought to ourselves, how do we do that? Do they use Google Calendar? Like, do they use calendar apps on their phones? Like, do they have filofaxes? Like, I had an agenda when I was in the 11th grade. Do they? And the answer is no. The answer is the number one way that young people remember to do something is they take a screenshot with their phone and then they go back to their Photos app to look at what that thing was. I mean, it's idiotic, but But instead of trying to change that, if we want young people to fight to end discrimination in their schools, we need to understand where they're coming from. And so we always fight to really understand where young people are coming from. And if we're creating a campaign, don't think about what we want them to do. What do they want to do? What are their pain points? We always hear that, FOMO, fear of missing out, is a pain point for young people. I mean, peer pressure for years has been getting young people to smoke and drink and do drugs. So can we get peer pressure and fear of missing out to get them to do good stuff? And so trying to sort of flip that on its head as much as we can and really understand the data. I'll just end with one thing that I think is so interesting is, and again, we work with 13 to 25-year-olds, but really sort of high school students and early college students. And if you look at the data, high school students, and this is true for everyone in this room, do drugs less than you did when you were in high school, have sex less than you did, smoke weed less than you did, get in fights less than you did. High school students today are better than you. And so it's just good to remember that because, you have this point of view of these young people, and then it leads to all sorts of, misinformation. So I think sort of looking out on Fight for the User right in front of my desk is always a nice reminder of that.
Great. I love Fight for the User. And it makes me think about trying to build a culture at an organization that has this kind of mindset, and get out of our bubble, think about who we're trying to serve, and figure out how to do that, even though it can be labor intensive, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of interested in what people's sort of growth curve on this is, either as a leader of an organization or in terms of bringing the organization along and building the capacity to engage stakeholders effectively. For me, I went from being a program person to leading the organization 6 years ago, and I just figured that all my success leading the program teams and initiatives and also having some expertise in engagement, because that sort of was my title, would just translate beautifully to leading the organization. It wasn't true. The pressures were different, the stakes were different, the psychology of it was different. My sort of introverted nature took a beating in a way that I wasn't used to. I mean, I'm okay in a situation like this, but cocktail parties, I just want, I'm worn out after 10 minutes and need a Netflix and a nap.
It's the teen version of Netflix and chill.
Yeah, exactly. So I've had, and also, a lot of my big brilliant ideas I was hanging on to I was being too defensive about them and not kind of letting my team in, and I've just had to kind of relax and figure out, how to do it, and bring sort of expertise that I had to the table, and then engage the organization, and then move out from there much more effectively. Still learning, still trying to figure it out, but I'm kind of a little over at least the first hump on that. So, but I think, we all have our journey in terms of figuring this stuff out, either as individual leaders or in terms of our organization and building a culture and a capacity to listen and not just talk, and to build relationships that can really serve the cause. So I just was wondering if there's anything, about our growth curve or the growth curve of our organizations that we could share.
Well, I will say that, I spoke a little earlier about sort of the whole, all volunteer kind of, organization. And we actually were one. As I mentioned, we started with that dinner conversation in 2002. And for our first several years, we were, because we started with an idea and not with a significant injection of cash, we had this sense that, and there were so many needs in the community, we had the sense that every dollar we raised, we had to give out, when there were so many needs. And so we had part-time staff, but for the first several years, we had no full-time staff. And so I feel like at that time, the board and our founder, and I was one of the board members, we were engaged in a way that it was really like a second job. And there was a lot of passion. And I think, so many organizations go through that kind of growth cycle, but you kind of hit a wall and you realize that, you have to invest, in your own capacity and in your own infrastructure. And when that happened, and in 2008, and I actually changed my role and I became the first full-time staff person at KACF as the executive director. We now have a full-time staff of 5. What we needed in terms of our sort of board shifted from being really hands-on to being more of a governance board and a fundraising board and more strategic thinkers. And so those were all the kind of dynamic tensions that an organization that wasn't used to having professional staff had to make those adjustments. And so I think that was a challenge, but it was really necessary for our growth. And I think as in the first panel, as Thomas said, you have to sort of meet your stakeholders where they are. In the same way that we were kind of meeting our donors where they are, we were meeting our grantee community where they are as well. And so for many immigrant-led and serving organizations, they are at a place again, of just of survival and not really thinking about sort of long-term, impact and effectiveness and really having a business plan. And so we actually have been listening a lot to our grantee partners and what their needs are, and everybody needs funding. But what they also really needed was technical assistance in language and culture that they understood. And that didn't exist because we were trying to hire, consultants who could work with our grantee partners. And, because all our parents told us to go be doctors and engineers, we didn't have any nonprofit professionals who could play this role. So we actually started a partnership with CRE, Community Resource Exchange, where we identified fellows who are actually housed at CRE. They're bilingual, bicultural Korean Americans who are getting trained at CRE and then go out to our grantees. And they are doing a lot of important work around, mission, vision, board, and governance, and around fundraising in a culturally competent and linguistically competent manner. So we're really, continuing to innovate, but that was really driven by listening to the needs of our grantee stakeholders.
Ari, I have a question for you that came
Sure.
from the audience. So because we're have some not limitless time, let me start bringing the audience questions in. How do you focus your organization's work? Seems like you could be all over the place.
Oh, tell me about it. So that was my number one theme so I became CEO a year and a half ago, and sort of to your point, I was like, oh, this is great. Like before I was COO, now I'm CEO. It's all going to be the same. People are going to talk to me and give me the inside scoop just as much as they did before. There'll be no fear. Absolutely incorrect. But the big thing that we needed to do was focus. And I think the hardest thing is because there's so many amazing causes and so many amazing not-for-profits that come to us and say, oh my God, you need to run this campaign around XYZ cause. We would love an infusion of 50,000 young people, 100,000 young people on this cause. And we got in that trap where every organization that came to us, it was a great idea and we'd run a campaign. Everything that happened in the news, every celebrity that came to us, and so it was absolutely nuts. And so I think especially at a nonprofit, everyone's there because they want to do good. So the idea of turning down a fellow nonprofit and saying we're not going to work with you is really, really difficult. And so we just had to focus back on our metrics. And so we focused everything we were doing around super numbers-driven KPIs that we look at it on a quarterly basis, and that really helped us dig deep into, we could run that campaign, but it's not popular with young people. It'll only activate 5,000 young people. We could do a similar campaign that would activate 100,000. The ROI on that it's not even a question as to which we would run. So I think sort of analytics and the access to open data really helped us make those decisions.
Okay. So another question is how would a nonprofit set up a new stakeholder engagement program? Where to begin?
Well, so we actually do this a lot because about 3.5 years ago we started this little consultancy called TMI within Do Something, and it's an earned income revenue stream, and they work with nonprofits and brands both on external, how to engage young people with all their expertise, but also sort of changing their internal culture. And I think one of the big things that we've learned about how to sort of set up a program like this is that you have to step back. And first, you have to be open to feedback and change. And so you might think that your organization is open to feedback, but it's really tough to create a safe space for feedback for all of your employees. And I mean, to Do Something, we are far from perfect. But one of the things that we did was we put into place a biannual Fail Fest. And you're nominated by your manager to present at Fail Fest. And you have to wear a pink boa. And you present to the whole organization, and you give the background of the issue, and then you also talk about 3 things you learned and 3 things the organization learned. And this is just so helpful because, one, we so often sweep our failures under the rug, so we never learn from them. We're never able to pivot. We're never able to change course. We're never able to get that sort of stakeholder feedback. No one's bubbling it up because no one wants to tell anyone that they did a bad job. But also we've promoted people directly after FailFest because they did such a good job at sort of assessing what they were doing and where they were screwing up. But third, it just creates a culture where if someone says oh, I don't want to run this program, I'm nervous it's going to not succeed. I'm like, what's the worst thing that could happen? You'll put on a pink boa and you'll present at FailFest. That's not a big deal. No one gets fired from FailFest. And so I think there's little fun things that you can do that actually then sort of, become part of your culture that makes it easier to seek feedback from stakeholders being fellow employees, but also obviously those that you serve.
And in the pivot session, we also heard about people getting some capacity funding to do things like pivoting and strategic planning and things like that. And if you're trying to get going on it, you might be able to build in some stakeholder engagement into a strategic planning process and try to get some outside help to do that, just as a way to kind of get going. But I mean, this kind of work can be, formal and expensive, or less formal and less expensive. A lot of it is an attitude about listening and conversation and putting the end user or client first, and kind of starting where people are and things like that. And that has to do with, you setting that tone in your organization and hiring people that have that sensitivity and things like that. And then it can get more and more, developed and involved.
Yeah, and for us, I talked about our community grants committee work, which has been really great, and it's part of our annual grant cycle, but it's very limited because we accept about anywhere from 20 to 30 people a year. And so just from feedback, and this year being our 15th anniversary, we actually have decided to have the first ever Korean American Giving Summit. And we're planning this, and it's a really a large scale exploration into the needs of our community and also why we give and how we see ourselves, an immigrant community as philanthropists, and what does that mean? And so we're planning to have, very, role model philanthropists, but also Korean Americans who are working in the field, and then also having sort of a blown up kind of, experience for our community. And that's a new sort of stakeholder engagement. It involves a commitment on our time and for our staff as well. But this was something that is an outgrowth of a sort of smaller steps that we have taken.
So let's, at the end, talk about something that's in everybody's heart, which is fundraising, and the relevance of this topic to fundraising and donors and that sort of a thing. So I have a question for Kyung, but I think there's different ways we can answer it that's more general. And that question is, how intentional are you in your participatory grant making process as a donor education effort?
Yeah, so I will say, our participatory grant-making vehicle has been a wonderful way to steward donors, and not just donors, but really future board members. I think we, everyone, our leaders come through this. I mean, there's a few ways. Every year, we also have like our big fundraising gala in the fall. And that has become, kind of the go-to event for the Korean American community. I mean, we have had, like 1,000 people attend. We raise over $1 million a year, year after year. Our keynote speakers have been like Pan Ki-moon and Ken Jeong, sort of like a wonderful star power of Korean American community. We find that, that's been a great way to celebrate and bring people together and to get, support. But we have seen that the people who have gone through our participatory grant making are often the ones that are so passionate about filling a table of 10, at our gala. And so there is very much a symbiotic relationship there.
I would think for many of you who are asking about sort of how-to on this stuff, if you think about your donor engagement work, it's like, a lot of you have that mindset with donors of really engaging them and finding out what their interests are and like meeting them in the middle and that kind of a thing. And it's about applying that to other sorts of critical stakeholders that are important to your work. What about digitally? How do we interact with folks and get feedback and put the user first? In terms of data, in terms of
one thing
their interaction with you.
We're really conscious of is the difference between implicit and explicit data. And so we obviously all know that filling out a survey, you're probably not going to get sort of the deepest held emotions, and you might not even get the truth. When we take surveys of young people and we ask them what's the #1 cause you care about, sort of soldiers and the troops always comes up in the top 3 as one of the most important causes. But when we look at the implicit data on our website and we see what people navigate to and choose, soldiers and our troops is dead last. And so you really need to think about what are people saying versus what are they actually doing. And also think about sort of the method for feedback. We find that text messaging is just, you feel anonymous, there's no filter, you're much more informal. So we got amazing feedback the day after the election. We send out a text message asking our membership, how they feel, how they were doing. We have a very, very diverse membership. And I mean that in every way. We're in every area code in the country, we over-index people of color, but we're also more likely than the average teen to go to church on Sunday. And, we're probably 20 or 30% conservatives or Trump supporters. And so we found that text messaging, just the media mattered, and that was a method in which we were able to get really unfiltered, direct feedback from young people that they might not be willing to give to us face-to-face, or even in a more formal email survey. So again, I would think about sort of the method, and I feel the same way with our staff. We do anonymous feedback, we do in-person feedback, we do a staff survey, we sort of do all of the different methods, because obviously people, some are introverted, some are less introverted, and you need sort of different methods of feedback.
Good. Well, that's our time, so I want to thank Kyung and Arya.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you guys for your attention and all the good work everybody in this room is doing. So thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you, Will, Arya, Kyung. That was excellent. And again, for all of you who were here this morning, you heard uptick in trust in NGOs, which is a bright spot, how we can be an example to the rest of the world. But to do that, you have to pivot in order to be able to maneuver in this environment or any environment, and you have to engage. You have to know the difference between just plain old communication and engagement.